How's your computer? Okay. All right. Hi, Lindsay.
Hi, Joanna. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, and we're sorry about Instagram Live not working. It seemed like it wasn't our fault because we restarted our devices and everything, and it just kept crashing. So millennial fail. We're too old for Instagram, so we're hopping on Zoom.
Yeah, no luck with these apps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we can get started here, and we'll see if questions come in from Twitter, but otherwise you have a big list of interesting topics, so we can just go over those. Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so today we have Joanna Chiu, and she is a Vancouver-based journalist covering both Canada-China relations and current affairs on the West Coast for the Star. She is a former correspondent in Hong Kong and Beijing, as well as a graduate of the Columbia University School of Journalism. And she's also the author of the wonderful, brilliant book, China Unbound, which examines the global political impacts of China's rise. Joanna is also an expert commentator on broadcast networks and chairs the not-for-profit NüVoices network to support women and minorities in China-related fields. So please welcome Joanna, who is one of my oldest friends and one of my most smartest friends. So I'm so glad to be chatting with her today.
Oh, thank you so much, Lindsay, for being so busy and writing your million books and taking the time to read my book and do this event with me. I really appreciate it. It's been so great to see you get so much success in first writing your memoir and then your YA novel, and now you're working on, you finished a short story collection, right? And it's going to be published next year.
Yeah, we're on our last round of edits. It's due at the end of October. So I've been trying to get it done. I've also been teaching. So I just finished class, trying to get on Instagram. And I was like, Instagram hates me.
Yeah.
Hates both of us. But now we're here.
Yes. Yeah. So I guess I'm a journalist in my day job. So I balance reporting for a newspaper and writing this book, my first book. But you have a career of writing book after book while teaching and doing a lot of workshops. So it's just a hustle both ways, but I'm impressed by your massive creative output, because writing one book took so much from me. I can't imagine on a schedule to write book after book, year after year, like you are.
Well, I think the trick is, one, I don't sleep. Two, I don't have a social life right now. So I don't know how people do it, who they have the perfect, work-life balance. I just don't. I'm sure there is a secret, but I haven't found it yet.
Yeah, I think the secret is having some sort of magical source of income, so you're not completely relying on making money just from writing, because I think that's kind of the secret in the publishing world, that people who do have that more balanced work-life balance usually aren't depending on just books for their income. There's usually some other source of support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think with a lot of people don't realize, and I've had people tell me oh, should I quit my day job? And I'm like, well, the average writer in Canada makes 10 or 11K from their writing, which isn't enough, right, to live in a city if you live in Vancouver or Toronto.
Yeah.
And so, you end up picking up a lot of different jobs, different gigs, and it's all about the hustle. But at the same time, it's if you take on work, do you have time to write?
Yeah.
Because it does, book writing takes so much out of you, as I'm sure you know now, after having you work full-time as a journalist, you've written your book, you're so busy. I think you travel with your social media before COVID.
Yeah, so for the book, I actually wanted to give people on the ground experiences, kind of almost giving every reader the experience of having lived in China, and then going to different countries to examine their relationship with Beijing. So there's a lot of on the ground reporting and interviews, and some of my eyewitness accounts of what it was like living in China and being a frontline reporter at some major diplomatic events and summits. And when I was a reporter, I saw, the Chinese president Xi Jinping multiple times. Like, I was able to observe him for years and see how he related to different leaders. So I think when we see China in the news, it just seems like such a big topic. I really wanted to, in the book, try to humanize it and provide a bunch of different perspectives that people might not often see in the news, including people who are like us, coming from kind of Chinese cultural backgrounds, who are part of the diaspora, which I talk about in the book, often comes under like different pressures from different sources. They might, if they're critical, get pressured or intimidated or threatened by the Chinese state. And also they might face xenophobia, or kind of like their loyalties often get questioned, even in the West, by Western societies. So people in the diaspora kind of get the pressure both ways. And it can be easy to see why a lot just give up and decide not to share their expertise and their close knowledge of and understanding of what's happening in China.
Yeah, it's amazing what you do with the book. You're able to take so much reporting and so much information, and you distill it so that it's so accessible to everyone, but also really vivid. When you were writing, was it hard for you to sort of balance creative writing with reporting? What was it like going from short form journalism to something long and essentially kind of nonfiction?
Yeah, so when I was a reporter for AFP, Agence France Presse, which provides like all sorts of feature stories, news stories, analysis stories for the world media, we did try to use some narrative nonfiction techniques. So anytime I wrote a feature on China, I would have like 2 paragraphs basically in the top of the article to try to like paint the scene as much as I could. And then, try to weave some of that color. We call it color when it's kind of like not just news reporting, but commentary or descriptions of scenes, what people look like, what the atmosphere is like. That's color. So we try to do that in a news story, but there's this limited word count. Like a feature piece for AFP, these major news wires might be 800 words, like 1,000 words tops, because they have to fit into different newspapers and magazines layouts. We provided the stories that people can grab and stick in their newspaper, before deadline really quickly. So often I was under a lot of constraint as far as how long a piece could be. Even writing for magazines, like I wrote for magazines like Foreign Policy, Economist, Quartz, Atlantic, things like that. And also longer sometimes, it's still a constrained word count. So I was very interested in storytelling and trying to cram as much kind of like liveliness in those stories, but it doesn't compare to the space you have in a book to try to do that. But even in a book, I think I was very ambitious. Like each chapter is set in a different country. So it was kind of like a case study and comparative case study approach, because I felt like as a Canadians, we often view news from China through the Canadian lens and Canadian perspective. And same if you're American, if you're European, you're kind of in your country's media environment when it comes to China. So I wanted the book to really like help improve people's like wider understanding and have more nuance and context globally, because we see, the tensions and the areas of concern with China. There's similarities across different countries. And people are also worried about certain countries like Russia or Turkey becoming closer to China because their governments are similar in authoritarian governance. So I really wanted to like show it and have it be vivid, like you said, and to actually be there and interrogate some of the assumptions that people might have. And to keep people reading, I wanted to use techniques of narrative nonfiction more so than I was able to do in news stories. So to each chapter might have, I tried to limit it to a few more prominent characters, even if I talked to a lot of people in the chapter, for the ones that I really paid attention to develop as more characters. I use techniques like describing their mannerisms, giving their backstory, because as a writer, that like for a character to be kind of real, even in fiction, the reader kind of has to know their backstory. So I wanted to provide that, like, how did they get involved in China issues? Where are they coming from? Or were they, like some people, trying not to be involved in politics at all, but it just happened to them? Like a student I spoke with from China, living in Quebec, where he was a law student and he went on the internet for the first time, the free internet, uncensored internet, after arriving in Canada, and he had 2 Twitter followers. And he was just experimenting, and he retweeted a few posts, including one that was satirical of Xi Jinping. And months later, police actually showed up at his parents' place and threatened his parents to tell them to put pressure on their son to, stop being on Twitter. And they did that before, reaching out to him. So it was kind of a very, like, threatening tactic. Like, we know who your parents are. You think you're anonymous, but we track you down, and your parents are still in China. We could do something to them. So that was an example of a story that I think people connected with, because when we think about cyber attacks and espionage and intimidation from the Chinese state, it seems like very, like, murky, kind of almost like science fiction, but I tried to make it very real in the book and to include as much detail as possible, and also to be really careful with fact checking. So the details I'm providing, like, I have photographs, documents, recordings to back it up as well.
Yeah, wow, it's amazing. A lot of new writers, especially narrative nonfiction writers, they always ask, like, what details are important and what are necessary in a book, and what do you leave out, right? I'm assuming when we were doing research and you're interviewing people and finding their backstories, you want to kind of get everything done first. But what makes it into the book and what doesn't?
Yeah, so like I said, I traveled all over the world for this book, and I also kind of dug into my notebooks from my time in China, my 7 years in Hong Kong and Beijing. So the first 2 chapters kind of give the background of what it was like in China, as there were increasing crackdowns on civil society. And I was grateful that I had not only taken notes, because my notes are really messy in my notebooks. I had also taken audio recordings and put it into the cloud, like Google Drive, or emailed them to myself. And I had taken photos and videos. I actually kind of relied sometimes on looking back on my old Twitter posts, because when I went to an event, like covering a protest in Hong Kong, it's easier to, like, take quick videos and then post it to show the scene when you're live tweeting or putting up some photos. So then looking at that, kind of those archives that I made myself, not knowing that I was going to write a book in the future, but just in the course of reporting and sharing it on social media, it kind of made me remember what it was like at that moment a lot more than if I were, like, looking through my stack of notebooks. Because, like, to be honest, like, I trashed a lot of those notebooks, like moving internationally from Beijing back to Vancouver. Like, I didn't have a job lined up in Canada, so it's not like an employer was going to pay for all these boxes to be shipped over. But luckily, like, I would say, like, use the cloud, like, email yourself stuff that you think might come in handy in the future, even if you think you might be moving on from a topic, because, leaving China, I felt maybe I would be moving on to covering other issues. But shortly after returning home in 2018, Wang Wanzhou, the Huawei executive, was arrested in Vancouver airport and sparked out this major diplomatic crisis. And the 2 Michaels just returned home 2 weeks ago, and it had been over 1,000 days. And during that time, I was working on this book, trying to figure out why Western countries seem so shocked about what happened, seem so unprepared for China's growing authoritarianism. So I was glad that, I got a book deal a couple months after that I had some of these archives to draw on. As far as, like, what to include, I think that was really the difficult part, because there's just so much material. I was trying to cover so much. If you look at the table of contents, people have pointed out, like, it just shows the breadth. I just have, like, Australia, Greece, Italy, Russia, like the Uyghurs, a new Cold War, things like that. It's so broad because I think I wanted to be accessible. I wanted to be one book anyone could read and really understand like wide breadth of the complexity of issues that come up in the news. But to make it kind of compelling, focusing on some characters, I really had to try to step out of my own perspective and think about my target reader and like which character, which people would they connect with or find more interesting. So I had, I spoke with you, Lindsay, like we worked together in a coffee shop and you helped look over my chapter in Turkey. So chatting with people about who they would find interesting, and then I would kind of build them up, kind of build the narrative of each chapter around these key scenes. I forget which narrative nonfiction book I got it from, but the creative writing professor suggested looking through someone's narrative essay or work of narrative nonfiction and blocking out where there are scenes, because usually an essay or a chapter is built around certain scenes, and in between you have context, you have analysis, you have facts, and then you go from scene to scene and you kind of thread it together. So that's how I tried to approach each chapter. And there was also limited room in each chapter, so I would try to find like some concise ways to bring these people more alive, and not just relying on she had long, beautiful hair, or he was tall and, brunette, like, because that could seem sort of objectifying of certain people, which my editor caught, like, you said she's like fair skinned and blah, blah, blah. That kind of sounds like, romance novel. So we had to edit things like that. But things like mannerisms, like using like really punchy quotations from them that reflects their personality, like subtle ways to try to make them kind of like three-dimensional characters in the chapters. Like, how about you? Because like your first book was a memoir, and those people are like so alive and intimate to you because they're your family, but how did you kind of impart their characteristics and along with like the themes and the kind of like the content about mental health in your book?
I'm just gonna, can you just wait just a quick sec? I'm having technical issues right now. The computer is not charging, so I'm just gonna have to try to figure out why.
Okay. Well, we're having such bad luck with technology.
I know it's plugged in, but it's not charging, and it says it's gonna die in a second. So I'm gonna have to figure this out. Okay, it's working. Oh my God. Okay, we're good. I'm so sorry. Yeah, I feel. So the question was, how do I capture vivid characters? And so with memoir, we're allowed to sort of rely a lot on fictional techniques, right? So we're looking at, characters from the point of view where they're three-dimensional, right? In real life, people do things that are not necessarily nice or correct, right? But they have interesting backstories. And so, we are interviewing them. We are trying to flesh out their psychological motivation. But what's really interesting about memoir, and I know it's very different than creative nonfiction, we change details. We change characteristics. If someone teaches math at school, we might say, oh, they teach geography, which is like a no-no in journalism, right? So in so many ways, it becomes almost a fictionalizing or like a manipulation of the truth, right? Whereas I think as journalists, there's this, I think, an understated horror when I'm like, well, you can change this a little bit, you can move this around, right? I have journalists in my class who are like, this is not nonfiction, right? When I say this is memoir, they're like, this is fiction. So I'm kind of in that weird gray area. So when you, going back to your book, we were in Starbucks and you were writing and I was like, oh, how about this? Or like, I was asking you about like the scene setting. For you, did it feel kind of strange when you were writing this book to add all these creative details?
Yeah, because, like you said, for journalism, you can't even shift chronology. I can't be like, first I interviewed this guy and then I went across the city. If it was like I was in this spot, I can't say like for the sake of ease of the narrative to adjust things because it's journalism at the end of the day. And I'm a journalist, and these topics I'm writing about is like so important, like China and human rights. So when you were helping me out at Starbucks when we were doing our writer's date, you were helping me look over the beginning of my chapter set in Turkey, where it's kind of like the last place, one of the only places journalists can kind of access and speak with people who survived or escaped from Xinjiang. And the most, actually the most pressure I had to make someone seem relatable and like a real human was this woman, Halalova. She was a Kazakh who was doing business in China in Xinjiang, 2015, and 2016, and then she got arrested and she spent 15 months in one of these infamous internment camps in Xinjiang. And again, she was one of those unique cases where it wasn't just her word, like she had her arrest document, she had letters her children had sent to the United Nations and the Kazakh government, like trying to get her out. So she had this mix of documentary evidence and her testimony that she gave me through a translator for hours in Istanbul. And I took photos of her. And I really wanted like so much for people to read her story and connect to her, because it just seems too staggering, like an estimated 1 million Uyghurs who were sent to these camps. It just seems like it's hard to see them as individuals. And then it was really helpful because you were asking things from a creative nonfiction point of view, like asking, what did she look like when she was speaking with you? Or can you describe like things like her appearance, or what was her reaction when this thing happened to her life? And I think the reaction part was helpful because there are these events that happened to her, right? Like first she was detained and then interrogated, and suddenly, for some reason, she was freed. Just kind of pausing and thinking about what her reaction was to the events, not just telling it, this happened, this happened, this happened. I think it added some like depth to that chapter. And she had actually given me a lot of detail I could work with. I just went back to the tape, and in the case for when a character was more important in my book, I actually did a transcription of the entire interview because I wasn't sure what I would need. That's not something I do or would recommend for like daily reporting for a newspaper. You just don't have time to transcribe the whole thing. I also use a transcription service where they give you like apps that they take the recording and then they spit out like an approximate transcript. And it gave me like something to work with so I could go back and like listen to it and fix some of the typos that the app made. So that was helpful, just to pick out little details and certain quotes that stood out that you can't notice as much when you're actually talking to someone. Because when you're talking to someone, especially when you're there and you know what happened to them, every word, every statement seems really powerful. But you kind of have to look at it really clinically, like the transcript afterwards, and be like, what really stands out? Because you only have so many quotes you can include on a page. It can't just be like a monologue from someone, and you have to like really pick and choose like really powerful statements, a really helpful or interesting statement. So I think that helps.
For sure, yeah. I think it's like you said, in journalism, you are in many ways shaping that truth because you have to choose some of the most important quotes. But at the same time, I guess the creative part is really showing us who these characters are, what do they look like, and that emotion behind it, right?
Yeah.
We are definitely allowed to kind of give our own opinion, right, in creative nonfiction. Whereas I know like journalists are like really removed sometimes, right? And you just kind of let the reader kind of make their own choice.
Yeah, and you know, journalists, every person has a bias, everyone has a perspective. And unless I think you set up a camera during an interview and just kind of live stream the entire conversation, that way you're not really putting your slant on it as much. But when it's a book and you're picking and choosing different quotes and different parts of their life to represent, you're also kind of presenting, like shaping the story. So I really try to like be open-minded to all the different people I spoke with. I didn't agree to everyone I spoke with. There were like tycoons in Greece and Italy who just seemed to look at China and Chinese people as just money bags, like kind of sources of capital to be exploited or to benefit Greeks. So, I tried to be open to their perspectives and to at least present it so that the reader can understand and make up their own minds about what they feel about these people. But definitely, even in journalism, you have to watch for like, what is the writer's perspective? What's their bias? So, and I think I try to preempt that by being upfront about my bias. Like right in the introduction, I say I was born in Hong Kong. My family left Hong Kong because they were worried about the handover to Chinese rule. I grew up in Canada. I had that, Western society upbringing, but I felt drawn and I spent time living in China where my thinking about China and Asia kind of changed. So hopefully, I think readers will have a sense of who I am because I'm the, in a sense, narrator of this book.
Yeah. So context is really important to set up and giving us biographical information. I've actually students who are so resistant to doing that, of putting themselves in a narrative or explaining where they're coming from or why they're writing something, right? And I think, what you said is really important to include. In creative nonfiction, we definitely talk a lot about creating a persona, right? And I wondered, like, when you were interviewing people in your work, did you have to sort of decide on the type of persona you wanted? Did you have to decide on a voice, or did that all come after you would talk to people?
Like how I would present myself when I'm like introducing myself to different people.
Yeah, and then when you were thinking about how you wanted to portray yourself on the page and writing, right? It's always interesting when you create something on the page. Is it really you, or is it a version of yourself?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of like books that are kind of semi travelogue where a writer is going to different places trying to figure things out, in a way you're kind of putting readers in your shoes. So I may have like emphasized or like my questions, like even if I had actually, by the time I sat down writing, had my kind of some answers in mind, as I was kind of writing out the scenes where I arrive in Athens, for example, or I arrive in Turkey, to try to present my mindset at a time where I was very inquisitive and I had a set of reporting questions I didn't know the answers to. So to help readers feel like they want to keep reading to get the answers, to get some insights, rather than me, with the benefit of 10 years of reporting now, kind of giving people my all my analysis and what I learned like upfront. So I try to kind of maybe like go back time in my head while I was writing, to like, what was I not sure of at this time? What surprised me? So during interviews where I was surprised by things that I was finding out, I would kind of express that on the page. So it's more like a dynamic narrator where I'm not static, like I'm changing my mind as I go along, and I'm kind of helping the reader see things kind of through my lens as well as I'm going from place to place. And if one person says something that challenges my perspective, I would go on and like try to talk to someone else, like get another expert perspective, for example. So I guess that was my technique in trying to keep people reading, because I'm not an academic, so it would be disingenuous of me to be like, doing a lecture in the form of a book, and those exist, like, and they're very helpful, I'm sure. But, journalists are people who go around the world asking questions of many, many people and gathering that information and presenting it to their audiences. So it's really a journalist point of view. And I think when it comes to narrative nonfiction, I think that naturally helps people feel engaged because the answers are not all given upfront.
Right, they're filtered through that narrator, that character who is like the protagonist of the book, and the person is always changing and growing. kind of filtering that information, which is
Yeah.
really interesting.
And also, I think people who read it got a sense that I was struggling with different issues. Like, one of the main tensions in the book is that people who are critical of the Chinese government and human rights often come to the same conclusions or recommendations for policy that people who are just openly racist and xenophobic and talking about China perhaps for personal political gain also arrive at, such as, for example, putting like international criticisms of what's happening in China. People coming from different perspectives, genuine care about human rights, and people who just want to, bash China often come to those same perspectives, and they can be kind of painted all in one group. Or people use legitimate criticisms of the Chinese state as a way to legitimize their distrust of Chinese people as a whole, or treating like as if all 1.4 billion Chinese people in China support what their government is doing, even though it's not a democracy there. So I think throughout the book, that was a tension because I was finding out and reporting on such, tragic things, like tragic human rights crackdowns on people and global intimidation of China's critics. And at the same time, personally, I would receive and experience more racism and discrimination and distrust. And a lot of people like me who care about, the human rights issues in China are also very worried that our words and criticism will be used as ammunition by people who are racist and xenophobic, and people who like clearly even want to start a war with China.
That's a lot. And I think it can be a lot of pressure, right, when you're thinking of a book. And were you thinking about the audience when you were writing? Did you think about the reactions that people would have to this book from Westerners, and I guess also from China as well?
Yeah. So often when I would write like a standalone story on what's like the national security law in Hong Kong that's cracking down on really moderate free speech in Hong Kong, or I'm writing a piece about like some testimony from what's happening in Xinjiang, usually people would see the headline and then say something like, China is terrible, burn it all down, like, pass all these sanctions, and they would just kind of use the headline instead of even reading the story to just kind of like have that really angry response, often very aggressive and almost like kind of beating the war drums kind of thing that we've been seeing more and more. But so far, I think the reaction to the book has been a lot more nuanced than I expected, which I'm really happy about, because people seem to be also looking inwards, because the book, it doesn't just criticize China, it criticizes Western governments and Western societies on being so slow to understand what's happening, and often making things worse, or saying that they support human rights on one hand, but then failing to pay attention when like people saying Canada are trying to go to police, like that student who was threatened by Chinese police. He went to Canadian police to try to report the case, but he said Quebec police just basically laughed him off and did not even record down his statement. So I wanted like the book to have people look at what the responses have been and where the shortcomings are, and kind of like the underlying reasons why Beijing has been able to kind of basically do what it wanted for so long. So rather than just China bad, we're perfect, like we did everything right, like we're just the victims.
What have Chinese readers said about this book? I know it's being celebrated in Canada and the US, and Publishers Weekly praised it as being doggedly reported and fiercely argued, right? So congratulations on that.
Well, I've heard a lot from the Hong Kong diaspora and people in Hong Kong who are really supportive and happy that what's happened in Hong Kong for the decades was put into context in the book. I haven't heard much from mainland Chinese friends. When I have, people might give me some praise or feedback privately, but say, I would love to recommend your book publicly to people to read, or I'd love to, in a perfect world, have you zoom in to like a book club in Beijing, but unfortunately it's way too sensitive and it might put some of them or their family members or colleagues in danger. So that's the kind of response I had from friends and contacts in China, living in China, whether they're from foreign backgrounds or it's a mix of people who are Chinese nationals. The feedback has been positive because I think, they're my friends and supporters, so they're kind of looking at things for similar perspectives, but they can't speak openly about this book, even that fact they're reading it. They can't really post on Instagram, like, look what I got, because it's so, the atmosphere in China is just so repressive right now, where people don't know, like, what's a red line, what could get you kind of kicked out or deported or in jail. Like, I couldn't tell you what the red line is. So that's basically the response from Chinese friends. And also there's rising nationalism, and there are lots of kind of really ardent supporters of the Chinese Communist Party in China. So of course, like when I've spoken at events in the past or did talks, some people would, stand up and try to disrupt or argue with me. So I'm sure that will happen coming up as I do more promotion as well.
I know it's frightening what's going on and how these poor students. I saw. You mentioned that there was that university student who had just tweeted, and then the police called his parents, and even in the first chapter of your book, there's people who can't practice religion. How do you get people to trust you and to confide in you as a journalist? I think a lot of aspiring, nonfiction writers are always really curious about that.
Mm-hmm. I think I was in a unique position because, like, the first chapter is when I actually visit underground churches, Christian churches in Beijing, which are operating kind of in a gray area, because in China only like state sanctioned churches get the mandate to preach and to have like big congregations. But these underground churches exist, and for them, their loyalty is to God and to the church and not to the government. So it's like intrinsically a rebellious act to be religious in China right now. And it's risky to get together and like pray and listen to sermons. I think it helped because a lot of times when people are worried about foreign journalists, it's not because they distrust foreign media or think the journalists might twist their words or get them in trouble. It's because they think that the presence of this journalist or the fact that this article is being written will bring police, Chinese state attention to them. Mm-hmm. So in many cases in China, foreign media are willing to grant anonymity to sources because we know when it's really clear that they will likely get in trouble speaking to us. But even the fact of someone who looks foreign showing up, even if their intention is to grant this group anonymity, they're worried that, minor, like people, there's cameras everywhere in China, like there's this idea of like constant surveillance that it's more risky. So I think my just appearance as like someone who looks like a Chinese woman, like at the time, like when I started, I was in my 20s, so looking like a young Chinese woman, like was, it helped ease a lot of people's fears because they could walk down the street with me and not necessarily think that they're just attracting stares from people or like police on the corner wondering what's happening. So I think that helped just being myself. And also I would really recommend that if people are going to China, want to have a career in journalism or research in China, that they really prioritize working on their language abilities, like Mandarin. When I first started in Beijing, like I was like a learner, like intermediate at best. And I felt bad because even sensitive interviews, I would be relying on Chinese translators to help me out. So I worked like really hard Like it wasn't like natural to me to get my Mandarin to a place where I could do these interviews independently, because then it would just be me. Like I'm a Canadian citizen who would have that responsibility. It's definitely risky and kind of a controversial practice now to parachute into China, and then hire a local translator and then like try to go to this dissident's house, or bring a camera crew and then hire a translator and try to get them to get you access to like a labor protest or something like that. I would definitely in this atmosphere say like, maybe you can't write about politics or report on politics in China if you don't speak Mandarin. Like work on the language first so that you're not putting anyone else at risk to help you.
That's really good advice. Would you ever go back to China or Beijing to work?
I miss like China, like every day, basically, like the food, the people, like just the atmosphere, like biking around the city is just like, there's nothing that comes close to that. Like living in Canada where the streets are just like bare and like cars stop for you from like blocks away. They see you like even like close to an intersection. Like, I mean, that like hustle and bustle of China is just so addictive. I think and people end up spending like their whole lives there if they're not from there. I don't know if I would even be able to go, and that I would, if I applied for a visa, I would get visa access at this point. And I kind of don't want to try because once you're rejected once, it kind of sets a precedent. Like everyone's like wondering like, when will things get better in China, the political situation. I think a lot of people are kind of waiting it out and seeing how things go, because there have been like periods of opening in China under the Communist Party and then periods of tightening. It's just that under the current leadership, it's just been tightening with no signs that it will let up. So I guess we will see, but I guess the mood is quite depressing and a lot of people have made peace. People like me who like are critical of China but love China at the same time have made peace with not going for the foreseeable future, which is sad.
It is, yeah, because you want to go back to your roots, right? And you want to have that access. I mean, I do want to go to China. I haven't written about China, so I'll probably be allowed in as a tourist. But it's also so depressing to know what's going on.
Yeah, it's hard to like go and have fun. Like even like say if COVID wasn't happening, and it's like visiting any country with really extensive civil rights crackdown issues, it's hard to think of enjoying going there while ignoring what's going on. And it's hard to anyways. You enter the Beijing airport and your whole phone doesn't work. All of the Google apps, Facebook, Instagram, like we talk about technical difficulties today, but compared to what it's like in China, where you have to like keep logging on to VPNs and try like a bunch of VPN servers just to log on to Twitter or Gmail. I think we do take for granted that it's so different.
I mean, we were like, we can't get on the social media.
Yeah.
But I guess like it's even like 100 times worse there. I guess like going back into like writing and publishing. So what does a typical writing day look like for you and your writing practice, especially during the pandemic?
Yeah, I want to kind of hear about what your typical writing day is like too, so we can share.
Go ahead.
So like one of the people who kind of like has been like sort of like a mentor and someone inspired me is Wong. She was the first global mail correspondent in Beijing of Chinese descent. And she said something early on when I was kind of like struggling with the book process, that the pandemic is not a writer's retreat. And people who think that, oh, you're so lucky you have all this time now to write, are kind of mistaken, because it's a global pandemic. Like you're under a lot of stress already. You're worried about your family, your own safety. It's hard to get into like the really like deep mental zone of writing and creating when you're stressed about other things. And it was definitely hard for me to prioritize and focus on getting these meeting these deadlines throughout 2020 when things were just
Floating.
Yeah, very, tense. Yeah, it's hard to compartmentalize. I think you just have to constantly, for me, the struggle was focusing on self-care and trying not to just be in this mode where I'm thinking about all of these serious China issues constantly, like to really just try to turn that off, think of it as work, so that I could recharge and not just be emotionally drained. When I was in Beijing, it was just at some points like journalists would just get together and feel like we had to almost have like group therapy because it was just so intense when like your sources would disappear. You talk to lawyers, you talk to teachers, you talk to writers, and then the next day they're in secret detention, like secret jails. That would just happen on a regular basis. So definitely, again, it's a privilege to live in Canada where it's not that hard to compartmentalize, because if I turn off my devices and stop thinking about work, I can go outside and like be in like the beautiful forest and talk to people whose lives don't revolve around China. So I think that is healthy, and it is easier for us not being in these really difficult places to unplug and unwind. What I did wrong at the beginning of the process was put a lot of pressure on myself, as if it was like hardline, like self parenting almost, as if I was like scolding myself if I would not accomplish something a certain day. I would be like, you have to keep that butt in the chair and just like spend all day writing. And I would block out like my whole weekend for work, or every single evening after work on the book. And it ended up just not working because I didn't schedule time or allow myself time to just not work. And actually, it's actually less productive when you set out to spend 8 hours writing rather than like, when am I most energetic, and then schedule 2 hours or 4 hours working on a book at the time where you know that you're going to be like the most, energetic, rather than being like, okay, all-nighter every night all the time. So how do you do it? Because I know that you said you had trouble sleeping, and it's like a lot to juggle.
Yeah, I mean, I'm listening to what you're saying now, and I think I really need to try what you've been recommending, like the 2 hours when you're more energetic. Because I find that because I've been doing a lot of teaching, a lot of workshops, a lot of residencies, whenever I have an hour or two, it's when I would write, when I would just try to get writing done. I'd pull the late nights like you, block out my whole weekend, I still do, and just feel that pressure, I think, to just always create. I don't know what it is about writing. It just never feels done for me. I don't know if that has happened to you.
Yeah.
There's always a new project, there's always something that comes up, right? And I think it's almost feels like an obsession, I think, when you're working on a manuscript, right? And then once you hand it over, they're like, when's your new book, right? And you need to work on a new project. So that has sort of been my writing practice. It has not been organized. I wish it was, but I think, going forward and hearing you talk about it, it's sort of, inspired me to reevaluate how I'm going to approach the revision and the next books, just so I don't burn out.
Yeah, I mean, burnout is the main risk, and then you end up not being productive at all because you're like, it's a mental health issue at that point. And
you're so tired, right?
Yeah, like you're just zonked, or you're just depressed by the subject matter, or you just feel like so I didn't take like sabbatical from my newspaper job. I took 1 month unpaid, and then I used all of my vacation time either reporting or writing the book for 2 years. So for 2 years, I basically didn't have any time off, including often many weekends. So I think like I tried to combine it. So like for my honeymoon, I like combined it with travel for reporting, So like I would be like interviewing Uyghur exiles about camps and then trying to have a romantic dinner with my husband like the same day. Like it was hard. It's important to have family support and people who are understanding, who might kind of understand that you're stressed and kind of have trouble juggling like other like family commitments. But yeah, so I ended up like getting to the point where I was so burned out, I was having panic attacks at night. So I got a doctor's note and I got medical leave from my day job for like a month and a half. And I needed that time to like sleep in and not have to juggle a busy day job with writing. And to take like a whole week where I didn't work on anything. And that was really helpful. I think writers like, it's kind of like almost like being masochistic and kind of almost engaging in self-harm is part of the culture, especially for people who don't have like a rich spouse who can just like fund their time to write without another, sources of income. But I think that's something that we kind of have to change. And I try to be upfront about that. I was so hard on myself that I ended up, being diagnosed with like an anxiety disorder and having to take time off work to, get over that. And I, in that time, I also, Zoom counseling sessions with someone who, a counselor who specialized in like stress management and like, visualization and things like that. And that helped a lot. And since then, I've been able to be a bit more realistic with my energy, my time, and to schedule self-care. It helps to have like mini deadlines. So you finish a chapter and then I would schedule time off, like at least like a whole weekend off, not working, or I would like indulge in online shopping and things like that. And I think it helps. Like you work towards smaller goals rather than like, I need to finish this book.
No, that's really helpful to know. Yeah, because I think we definitely do. We glorify like, oh, this person has a book coming out, and look how fast they're writing, and how hard they work, and and it just feels like that. Like it's like, how do you manage it all with 24 hours in a day? So that's really good to know.
Yeah, there's not enough time in a day. And I know maybe we should like change the culture where as soon as someone has a book out, one of the go-to interview questions like, what are you working on next? But usually by the time you're promoting your book, you're like exhausted because you had just finished like the revisions and barely had a few months rest before all of the labor with book promotion talking about your work comes up again. So maybe we should stop asking like, what are you working on now when someone's on book tour?
Yeah, we should. I do have that question for you. I was like, how is your new book, going? But I want to ask that.
Yeah. Yeah, I would like to like change gears and see if I can write fiction. So I'm not like saying I'm working on a work of fiction, but I'm partly for self-care is to experiment with a different genre where I don't have to be so like mired in like facts and reporting and my notebook and my transcription of 100 interviews, like being able to be in a notebook and like write a short story. Like I know for you it's like your job and it's stressful, but for me to try something different new, I think is something I might enjoy.
Oh, that's exciting. What type of fiction are you thinking about doing? Is it more like literary or genre or?
I'm looking into historical fiction. I'm not sure about like short stories or a novel length because I am still so fascinated by China and modern Chinese history. And like people in my family have had really dramatic lives just in the 20th century. So trying to look at that material and write about it. And have that flexibility to change the facts around and like make up characters. I think that sounds fun.
I can't wait to read it. That sounds something like I would love to do.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I guess going back again to your background as a journalist and writer. So for people who want to emulate this path, how and why did you become a writer and journalist, if you don't mind sharing?
I don't know, it's like anything, like sometimes when people talk about writing, it's like you have like inborn talent or you're just inspired or you have a muse and suddenly you write this bestseller, but it's just like a lot of work and training like every other job, I think. You mentioned like we both went to Columbia for graduate school, and before that I volunteered and I wrote for free as a university undergrad student for so many publications. And also just read a lot of books. I read a lot of like work from journalists I really admired, just constantly hoping that some of their talent would absorb. And I think, you have to read and just do a lot of practice as well to get better and better. Unfortunately, there is barriers because a lot of that initial training, like doing internships, often is really low paid, or you only get course credit. And not all people can afford to spend like 2 years like I did, basically as an intern or a journalism graduate student. My parents supported me during that time, even though I tried not to take too much of their support. And like I was pretty poor and like lived in like hovels and rat infested, cockroach infested apartments or really tiny apartments. So yeah, it's a lot of like moving up and like practice and going to like as many of these like workshops and conferences and training opportunities as I could. And I still do because you can never stop learning. It's just a lot of work. It's like basically being a student at all times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's never ending work and a lot of persistence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Did journalism school influence your career at all, or was it really helpful, or do you recommend people apply for journalism school?
It depends on what the school is like. I think schools that emphasize not just classroom learning, but hands-on learning and practice are the more helpful ones. If it's all like textbook and theory, I don't think that really prepares you that much to be a journalist. If you had to choose between doing a fellowship or internship or J school, if you only had, the funds to support yourself for 1 year, one or the other, I would say get a good internship because nothing really replaces actually doing it and having the high stakes of actually reporting for an outlet where if you make a mistake, everyone will know, you will have to issue a correction, or you might mess up on air or live radio or TV. Like kind of that pressure is hard to replicate in like the journalism school environment, as much as it's nice to kind of have a place where it's easier and safer to make mistakes in J school. If you want to like improve and get into that zone quicker, I think just doing it, either being freelancer or getting ideally a really good internship that has a lot of like hands-on learning and mentorship and training and supervision. I think that would be the best way to go about it. They're competitive, but it's not impossible to get a good internship. Like publications have these programs like every session. So if one season you don't get into, the ones you really want, you can try again like the next semester or the next summer. But it's a lot of persistence, and a lot of the students I meet who are interested in journalism, the ones who aren't sure that that's a job they want, they're the ones who drop out because there's so many disappointments along the way. It's like the people who really, really care and are passionate and can't imagine doing anything else that end up succeeding quite, surprisingly quickly, because you really need that drive to put up with like all of the stress and the pressure and the rejections of being like a writer and a journalist. As you know, like it took you like how many rejections before you got your first book published?
Like 13, and it was 6 years from time I graduated from Columbia, right, to finding a publisher. So I really wanted it. A lot of people were like, you just came out of the gate and got published. And I was like, no, you don't understand. I've been writing for such a long time. And so like when you really put yourself into that position and, you're sending out your hundreds and hundreds of queries and no response, it can be heartbreaking, right? And so it's really, how many people go to J school or do their MFA that continue writing, right? Not that many if you look at the numbers.
Yeah. Okay.
What would you do differently now if you could start your book again, or would you not do anything differently? And knowing what you know now about the business of book writing, what will you do differently for book 2?
Well, I was under like a pretty tight timeline to finish this book. So because it's so timely, and basically I got the book deal in early 2019, and I had a year to finish the reporting and then another year to do the writing and revisions. So a pretty complex book within 2 years, while not having time off work. So I wouldn't do it again. I think I coped with it as best as I could. And, I achieved it in the end, but I would not do it again and I would not recommend it, especially when you're also having a busy full-time job. Like I can give you all the productivity tips and like the, tips as I could, but in the end, I wouldn't do it again. It was a lot. So I think for a next book, if I do one, it would be something that's not quite so incredibly timely, that it's such a rush to get it out, like to have time to revise, like put the project away and then get back to it. So my choice of project would be like less like so current affairs, I think. Something more timeless. Although I do hope the book will keep being relevant because it has a lot of that historical context and for some years to come. I would again like put less of that negative motivation. I would have more positive motivation. I would like so many times I was like so hard on myself, like you achieved nothing, you like wrote one paragraph and then you deleted it, like what's wrong with you? And I would just really beat myself up over it, but that didn't work at the end. When I actually got more pages written was when I was nicer to myself, when I didn't expect perfection with every page, where I was like drafting it out without just meticulously self-editing along the way, which it just seems like you take one step forward and you're taking two steps back because you're like editing at the same time and like really harshly deleting everything. So then you end up with like nothing at the end of the day because you're so like anxious about it. And I would also tell myself to trust that editors are great. I worked with such like a team, like a successive waves of like really talented editors. I wasn't expecting there to be so much editing support for a book. I guess I'm used to newspapers where you get a quick edit and then it's out. Editors are great, but they're not going to like have long conversations with you about like, oh, where should we put this or that, right? I don't know what your experience was like, but with Nancy, I felt my editors were so good. They would notice if I repeated a really small detail, like 200 pages apart. They're like, oh, you actually mentioned this paper, on page 89 and you bring it up. I think you didn't know that. They're just so good at what they do. And knowing that I'm not alone in the process, that there's these professionals that help shape the book and polish the book, I think it would have alleviated some of the anxiety. Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's, writers are nothing sometimes without our editors because they just know what our intent is without us having to say it so explicitly. Like I have been really fortunate. I've had 3 different editors from 3 different houses, and all my editors have been amazing. They've been able to like really understand where the story's going. They know when there's a clunky sentence. So I think that editorial support is what really makes a book. It often doesn't feel like it's just a writer. It really feels like a collaboration, right? I mean, we have the same agent, and so we have edits from her, and then we also have edits from the editors, right? And we have better readers and critique partners. So yeah, it's a long process, I think, with book writing. But I do like the really long conversations about, where to take things, what to do. I've tried a bit of journalism, but yeah, I found it really different, especially in the comments and how brief they are. They just like want it out. And I don't know, maybe I expected a lot of edits when I was doing one piece, but then I was really surprised when it was so brief.
Yeah, I mean, as a journalist, you end up doing a lot of self-editing because your editor often, with newsroom shrinking, they have so many stories to get through. So if you send them something that's just like needs a lot of work, then I don't know, you might not have your job for much longer because you kind of need to be really good at self-editing as a, daily reporter. And a book as well, like, I think I just had to adjust to, I couldn't get it to the point where basically all it needed was like a quick polish and then out in the world. A book is just like so much more complicated and it needs like just dedicated attention from editors who do have the time to work on it really carefully with you. And also, like you said, like so many people are generous with supporting you, including definitely in the case of this book, like so many different experts in different fields that are my friends, you know, read over sections, like pointed out mistakes, pointed out things that could be a lot better. So the book I'm so much more comfortable with it being out there because experts in different fields took the time to review it. And actually, I use some of my advance to give them honorariums because I'm worried about asking for so much unpaid labor. So I would approach people with the subject expertise and like offer, you know, like a certain amount for them to spend time to give me notes back. And again, position of privilege. I'm not relying on this book to make me money to help me buy a house. So I was able to do that with my own resources. But not every writer can do that, like hire a consultant or things like that.
For sure.
So I guess, should we wrap up? Any last?
Sure. Can I just ask you a couple questions from the lightning round and then we'll wrap? Does that work?
Awesome.
Okay, so I have a couple questions and just feel free to randomly blurt out whatever comes to mind. Number one, writing a nonfiction book is like fill in the blank.
It's like a really, really long roller coaster. Instead of like a 2-minute roller coaster, it's like a 10-day roller coaster.
I was gonna say like pushing that boulder up the hill like Sisyphus and never finishing.
Yeah.
Number two, favorite interview that you've ever conducted and why?
It's hard to think about one, but I think just talking to the younger people in my book, including Chinese students, including one in Australia, who, you know, like that interview really stood out because he was at the same time really smart, but also really quite like naive and like wide-eyed about things. He was interested in the idea of exploring Shanghai independence and like cultural preservation of the Shanghainese language. And he ended up in jail in Shanghai, visiting his family for a few days. Really luckily that they let him out because I think he was like so young and just so obviously like naive about it. But yeah, talking to him was really interesting because it kind of just shows that there's so much like curiosity and like diversity in China and people coming from different backgrounds, and they don't often get their voices out in the news, like in books. So I was really glad to talk to people like that who gave that perspective. Yeah, people wonder like what will happen to the future of China, but I think the fact I was able to meet, you know, live with young people in China gives me a lot of hope as well, because a lot of thoughtful people, young people living in China right now who will end up being future leaders, hopefully.
It's amazing. And number three, favorite writing snack or drink?
Bubbly.
Bubbly. Anything bubbly.
Anything bubbly. I'm addicted to sparkling water. It just kind of gives you like sort of a like some alertness with the bubble. And you know, you're not like addicted to caffeine because there's only so much coffee you can drink.
I know at one point I was on 12 coffees a day. I don't know how I survived. And what are some books that you wish you had written, or something that you admire or envy in other writers' styles or habits?
I guess people who can just easily focus and turn off their phones and their Twitter. Like I say I can do that, or like I try to like hide my phone in another room, but I'm always checking. I totally failed in like turning off devices and just working on my book. That's really bad. So for people who can do that, I admire you.
I don't know anyone actually. Number five, three writers dead or alive that you would take with you on a 6-month tropical residency, and why would you take them with you?
I would take you.
Come, yay.
Like actually.
Okay.
And that's it.
That's it?
I think more than one writer.
Writers?
What?
Like good Asian writers?
I don't know. I think like I would like some alone time on that desert island.
We can split it. We can have you on one side and I on the other side, and then just meet for dinner or something.
Mm-hmm.
One piece of advice for aspiring nonfiction writers.
Keep notes and take lots of photos.
Okay. Good advice. Yeah. And number 7, writer superpower that you might incapacitate someone for.
Again, like the focus. Like
yeah.
Being able to just not get distracted or think about different things, and then also turn off and compartmentalize afterwards.
Yeah, I can't do that. It's so hard. And last question, number 8. Why should readers buy China Unbound?
Because it's 10 years of my life for $25. Good deal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, I lied. The last question is, what events do you have coming up, and where can readers find you online, and where can they buy your book?
Okay.
Actually, so 3 questions. Sorry, I lied.
The book is available wherever books are found across North America, on Kindle, on Audible as an audiobook. And the narrator is really good. Like, she's bilingual, so she's pronounces all the Chinese words perfectly, which you don't see in every book on China. And I would also encourage you to check out if there's independent bookstores in your area that carries the book, because all the main shops like Indigo, Amazon, Barnes & Noble have it, but it'd be really cool for me if my book helps the indie bookstore world, stay alive for one more day, because the margins are so tight at bookstores. So one way to check is indiebound.org, INDIE bound.org, and it kind of knows where you're logging in from, and it shows you when you search a book, like the bookstores near you that carries it. So I would recommend that.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time this afternoon to chat with me, and it was just so nice to catch up.
Thank you so much for all these questions, and yeah, your generosity as a writing community person to do events like this. I really appreciate it.
Oh no, we're friends, anytime.
Yeah, but you do this like all the time. Like, you have workshops and you host readings. So yeah, you do a lot to support this community.
So yeah, the writing community.
Yeah, it's great. Well, thank you so much, Lindsay.
Thank you. Talk soon.
Bye.